Our special guest today is Professor Adriana Cavarero. Good afternoon, Professor Cavarero.
Good afternoon.
And good morning and good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. I will formally introduce Professor Cavarero. Adriana Cavarero is an Italian philosopher and feminist thinker. She holds the title of Professor of Political Philosophy at the University of Verona. She has also held visiting appointments at the University of California, Berkeley, Santa Barbara at New York University, and Harvard. Cavarero is widely recognized in Italy, Europe, and English-speaking world for her writings on feminism and theories of sexual difference, on Plato, on Hannah Arendt, on theories of narration, and on a wide range of issues in political philosophy and literature. Trained in ancient philosophy with a special focus on the writings of Plato, and inspired by feminist philosopher Luce Irigaray, Cavarero first drew wide attention with her book In Spite of Plato. Cavarero's interest in the intersection of political philosophy and feminist thought was further developed in Stately Bodies, her book, of course, which examines the bodily metaphor in political discourse and in fictional depictions of politics, including Sophocles' Antigone, Plato's Timaeus, Shakespeare's Hamlet, Hobbes' Leviathan, Maria Zambrano's The Tomb of Antigone, and Ingeborg Bachmann's Undine goes. Her other works include Relating Narratives, 2000, For More Than One Voice, 2005, Horrorism, Naming Contemporary Violence, 2008, which is also the topic of discussion today, and her latest book, Inclinations, A Critique of Rectitude, 2016. It's such a pleasure to finally have you here on the screen, Professor Cavarero. And thank you for agreeing to be a part of this interview immediately. So in our discussion today on Pandemic and Margins of Care, Reinventing Cavarero's Horrorism, and that is the title of this session, we will try to find out if her notions of horrorism has undergone any change since the time she conceived it almost 13 years back, and also deliberate on manifestations of violence during the pandemic. So here goes my first question for you, Professor Cavarero. Let's say more than terrorism, exposing and exploiting the facets of vulnerability and care, aren't they concealed more in our daily political life and encounters with state apparatuses? So my question to you is, do you think we should redefine our understanding of terrorism and extend it to state-sponsored violence and propagandist crimes?
Yes, it is a difficult question because my definition of horrorism, which I define it as a neologism, so I think would be a bit difficult. But my intention was at the time to define a kind of peculiar violence targeting helpless people, completely helpless people. And for helpless people, I intend an example and representative of the most vulnerable. So I'm speaking of a specific kind of violence which is consummated on completely vulnerable people. So I'm not following the schema friend enemy, not the typical Carl Schmitt, or if you want, canonical schema of the concept of war, violence between two subjects. But I'm thinking of a specific subject who give on the other a violence which is a unilateral violence. So I think that whenever we are in a situation in which we have vulnerable people who are the main target of a unilateral violence whenever we can speak of horrorism, we can speak of a kind of violence which I define an ontological crime. I'm using this philosophical word, ontological, meaning something dealing with the fundamental human condition. This is what I mean for ontological, the human condition as such. So in my opinion, when we have the vulnerable people struck by unilateral violence, we have also a sort of offense, a sort of injury on the human intended as constitutively vulnerable. And this is why I think we can speak of an ontological crime. And I think that this is typical of particular types of terrorist attacks, when the people attacked, the people who die are people, everyday people, completely vulnerable and not aggressive. So this is typical of the history, so to say, of terrorism. But I think that this kind of approach could be applied to whatever situation in which we have unilateral violence on the vulnerable. So not a symmetric situation, but a strong asymmetric situation. No, not symmetric situation.
Right. So since we are adopting your neologism, horrorism, let us talk about degrees of horror. So what, according to you, what magnitude or intensity would amount to a crime to fall under horrorism? So I'm specifically referring to, let's say, a condition of lynching in India, or riots funding by majoritarian communities or ruling parties. Would you call that horrorism, riots and lynching?
I think that lynching is a typical example of horrorism, lynching. I don't know the situation in India. I'm not a scholar on Indian politics or Indian history, but I know a bit European history, and also in the history of Europe, we have a tradition of lynching. And so lynching is something consummated on a person who is assumed as killable and vulnerable. Not only the vulnerable, but the killable. And there is an intention in this kind of violence. So I think that we have to think about that, because it's always, I think you agree with me, it is always very difficult to categorize different kind of violences. We have to know the context, the situation. Is difficult to categorize. But of course, by being a philosopher, I have a drive to categorize. And my drive to categorize is that it doesn't matter if the victims are one only person or many persons. It doesn't matter. What matters is the relationship between perpetrator and victim. If perpetrators hold a strong and unilateral violence, and the victim is confining with the absolutely vulnerable, absolutely exposed to the violence of the other, we are in the situation in which we can speak, I could speak of horrorism. But of course, after you speak of horrorism, after you categorize, you have to ponder on the different situations. You have to ponder on the political context. I mean, philosophy doesn't erase the duty, the reflexive duty of history and politics.
Right. So again, can horrorism be also linked, let's say, to the figure of the unknown other entering our bodies? Let's say, something because of the impacts of capitalism, like erasing of forests, like excessive killing of animals. Let's say the virus coming from there and entering vulnerable bodies. And when I'm saying vulnerable, I mean all bodies. Do we extend the meaning of horrorism and include the virus there too?
If I understand well your question, yes, I think that what is vulnerable is the body. We are vulnerable bodies. It is not an abstract notion of vulnerability. Of course, we can also speak of people, of nations who are more vulnerable than other. We can do it, of course. But if we focus on the human as human, I think that as humans, we are vulnerable bodies. And you know that vulnerability, vulnerable, the etymological root is vulnus, is the Latin word, the term for wound. So we are vulnerable in the flesh. We are vulnerable lives. And I think that in this sense, we can have a different approach to animality, to the animals, but because we are animals. As a vulnerable body, the vulnerable body that I am, as such, I am an animal, I am animal. And so I can understand the animal. The animal is the other, is different. I mean, I am a human animal. And there are not human animals, but they are very similar to me, very similar to you. So we have to think about our relationship with animals as a relationship bearing the ethical perspective of a common vulnerability. And before I told you, do you hear me?
Yes, completely.
Because my computer is strange in this moment. Before I mentioned the ontological crime, I think that the ontological crime, as I intended, is most of all related to the human animal. But I think that we can think of crime, of an excess of violence in relation to the non-human animal.
Right. So you have also mentioned the aspect of beheading in your
I didn't
book.
understand. I mentioned?
The aspect of beheading, a terrorist beheading, cutting off the head. Yes, cutting off the head. So when we look at images of beheading circulated by terrorists, or search for rape or mutilation on porn channels, for example, what do you think we are looking for? So is there a simultaneous reaction of disgust and eroticism? Is the horror experienced by the other a hidden source of pleasure for me, who still retains the body, the whole body?
Yeah. I understand what you mean. I don't agree with this sort of aesthetics approach to the disgusting, I think that horror deals with the disgust, and there is no pleasure in disgust. And so there are some streams in contemporary intellectual debates dealing with a tradition going back to Bataille, to sort of postmodern, de Sade, or the French interpretation, the French postmodern interpretation of de Sade, which insists on the fact that the onlooker, especially the onlooker, experiences a sort of pleasure in the looking at horrors phenomena like the one of the beheaded. I don't agree with such an approach. I think it is an excess of asceticism. There is no ethic quality in this kind of approach. I think that the image of the beheaded, which is an old image I mentioned in my book, Medusa, I mean, it is an old image. We think of the French Revolution by being in Europe and the guillotine and so on. There is a profound, a deep horror in this image, which is disgusting for me, and the face, the element, the aspect of deep horror is linked to the dismemberment, the body, and we see the body as human. The body as human has a shape, and we feel this shape. We feel that we have this shape in common. It doesn't matter the color or the eyes, you know, something like that. We have this shape which is in common, and that's the same shape that makes us to feel a disquieting similarity with apes. For me, it is difficult to perceive apes as not human, because the shape is so similar that I tend to perceive apes as human. And then, of course, I know they are not human, but it doesn't matter. This is the idea. So, in my opinion, what I perceive as offensive, as injuring, as an injure dealing with the ontological human crime, is the fact of the dismemberment of the body, of the beheaded. And this, I think, could be a responsible approach to the spectacularity of the dismemberment. Because, of course, the terrorists, people who I call horrorists, they count on the horror of the spectacularity of the horror of the beheaded. And it was like that also during the French Revolution, you know, the guillotine and holding the head, the beheaded head. And they count on this because the spectacularity of the crime, they think that the spectacularity of the crime provokes a big horror, and so they think it provokes the possibility to hold the population in fear. And of course, it is also a manifestation of being strong. The more my crime is big, the bigger is my crime, the bigger is my strength, is my capacity to provoke fear. And this is notorious weapons of the history of politics, of the history of domination. I mean, it is not only dealing with the present. What is typical and peculiar of contemporaneity is internet, images, the sharing of images. As you know, because we are connected by Zoom, images and connection are come si dice, utilizzabili, I don't remember.
So
you can connect to images in all the world at whatever time or whatever location if you have the internet connection. So this pervasion of images multiplies the spectacularity of horror. But this is well known. It is not my discovering.
right. So I'm specifically referring, let's say, to a rape which happened of an 8-year-old girl, Asifa Bano, a Muslim girl who was raped by a priest and a policeman. And something very strange happened that 24 hours after her death, she was trending #1 on porn channels. Now, this is what surprises me again. What is that link between horror and pornography? Because they were really looking for her body.
Yeah, this is a serious problem, especially when the crime is consumed on a young body. The young body is in the tradition, the young body, the dead young body, the violated young body is part of this degenerated pornography. And in this sense, I think that the media are an important subject, and the media are not completely irresponsible. I mean, they doesn't respond of the exploitation of the possible pornography. I don't know if I got your question. I mean, I agree with you. In the tradition, in the literary tradition, let's mention the Sad, but not only the Sad. In the literary tradition, there is a connection between the violated body and pornography. The question I ask you, because I can ask you a question, of course, okay? You agree? The question is, at what extent the general media, I mean television or internet, at what extent they are collaborator of this degenerated link between the violated body and pornography?
I mean, the entire fact that it is available,
yeah,
that is itself a problem. You know, that child pornography is banned, and yet it is available for on proxy sites. You can just enter a different VP key and then enter those sites, and you will not be caught. So I think there exists a kind of duality, which I don't know how to answer, how to resolve. But after all, it is, as you said, it's not the fault of the channel which holds it, but if I'm the perpetrator, if I'm the one looking for it, it's my problem, I think.
Yeah. But yes, of course, it's your problem. If you are the perpetrator, okay. what I want to underline, it is that in a certain tradition of the last century, let's say the Western tradition, French, European, but also American, but most of all French and European tradition, there is an intellectual attitude to be indulgent with this approach. I mean, the explanation, if you think of psychoanalysis, but not necessarily of psychoanalysis, is that is human. And there are human drives, if you like, violated bodies, if you are excited by violated bodies, this just original drive, original instinct. I'm completely cross with this kind of intellectual approach. I think that this is a way to be indulgent with horror, to construct your intellectual theory, to be accomplice with violence. There is a complicity between this kind of approach and the perpetration of violence. And I think that this is very bad, and that we cannot admit or cannot support the idea that in violence there is something natural, something natural in our capacity or desire to kill the vulnerable body. This is not natural. This is a cultural construction. And I personally fight against this cultural construction. This is a patriarchal cultural construction, to have the human defined as violent, aggressive, driven to violence. Think, for example, of Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan. This is a cultural construction. There is nothing natural. There is no natural. There's only constructions. And I try to contrast every complicity, every theoretical and intellectual complicity with this kind of construction.
Right. So in your book, again, you mention that the history of violence is oriented towards destroying singularity, and I personally love the point. But we also, if we go into the history of violence, let it be the Nazi violence or something which happened 100 years back or 1,000 years back, the history of violence has always been the history of quantification. How many people died.
Yeah.
If it just had been 100 Jews, we wouldn't have bothered about it. And yet you write that it is about destroying singularity. How do you balance both? I mean, this is in us. I mean, when we read the paper, if we have an incident where where a plane has crashed, the first thing is how many people died. If it's just 10, we are not bothered. If it's 200, then it's a major accident.
Yeah. No, this is typical. This is typical because, for example, this is part of the spectacularity. The quantity is part of the spectacularity. For example, we are at 20 years from 9/11, and what mattered most in 9/11 was the quantity and the spectacularity. And the quantity at the beginning was exaggerated. I remember that the day after, American media were speaking of 30,000 people dead, and it was 3,000 people dead. Because there is this tendency to the amount, the quantity of the victims is part of the importance and of the spectacularity. On the other hand, or not on the other hand, but not unlikely, the modality in which this kind of horrorist violence works, the modality it works, is counting on the cancellation, on the erasure of the embodied singularity. Because the embodied singularity of the victims doesn't matter at all. They don't want to kill you and you name and family name, story life and so on. They want to kill an amount, a mass, an impersonal mass, anonymous mass. So quantity and anonymity are connected, are part of the horrorist balance, vision. On the other hand, inasmuch as what receives the injury, the ontological injury, is the embodied singularity, what matters, in my opinion, to construct a philosophy of the embodied singularity, or what Hannah Arendt calls the uniqueness, the embodied uniqueness. And this was an aspect of the aftermath of 9/11, because on the floor, on the walls of the buildings circundating the nearby 9/11, nearby the Twin Towers, there were many papers, many photos with people, name and family name, and the picture, and missing. What is missing is you, is me. What is missing is a person and incarnated singularity. What is missing? Because for us, in our life, the other is always an embodied singularity. And this way of living, this taste of our everyday life, to know you, to be known by you, and to have this concrete relationship of which life consists. This is a human aspect which is targeted by horrorism. The horrorists want to destroy the human as a plurality of singularities. It wants to destroy this relationship which constitutes life, community, and so on, real life. And in order to destroy that, they target the human as a mass, as an anonymous, impersonal, not personal mass.
Right.
As lives that don't matter, you know. The victim have a life that don't matter.
Right. So when we are considering, let's say, the aspects of wounding or vulnerability, do we consider the singular body or the community as a whole? For example, let's again talk about Muslims in India. Should the Muslims or the lower castes in India, work as separate categories to be cared for? So what I'm asking is it the singular person I'm looking ahead to care for? Is it the entire community?
I think with Arendt in this case, with Hannah Arendt, I think that the particularly vulnerable, the concretely vulnerable is always the incarnate uniqueness. Vulnerability is linked with the body, and the bodies are always singular. So we cannot go beyond this grammar, this vision of embodied singularities. On the other hand, of course, we don't ignore, history doesn't ignore that some communities, as communities, are more vulnerable than others. This is everywhere, also in Europe. And so I think that in order to construct a livable democracy, we have, first of all, to take care of the vulnerability of the singular body, first of all. But secondly, to take care of the vulnerability of some special types of community. You didn't mention, because you don't know it, I just published in English a book entitled Surging Democracy. It's published by Stanford University Press. It came out 1 week ago, 2 weeks ago. And in this book, I focus on the concept of democracy, of a surging, living, effective democracy. And I think that your question is soliciting the problem of democracy. I think that because vulnerability pertains to a singular body, always, but also, on the other hand, also some kind of communities are particularly vulnerable. I think that when we think of democracy, we have to connect these two aspects. If you put the vulnerability of the community first, in my opinion, you do a move that could be dangerous, because you could run the risk of considering identity more important than singular embodied uniqueness. I think that we have to be in balance regarding these two poles. Not to put identity first, but not to forget identity. Because if you forget identity, you forget history, you forget the context.
Right. So on the one hand, you have mentioned vulnerability, and on the other hand, you have mentioned care. So vulnerability, wounding, and then care. But personally, what do you think of indifference, let's say? For the last 100 years, the vulnerable people are simply at the receiving end of whatever happens at the upper levels. So that indifference, of course, is comparatively better than wound. Do you think it's a crime in itself?
Yes, I think so. I think that indifference is just to abstain from care. If you don't care, if you are indifferent, you let the vulnerable die. You let the vulnerable become more and more vulnerable. So I think that indifference is a very important and negative attitude, ethical attitude, and is also the easier attitude. I don't feel bad, I don't feel nasty, because I didn't wound, but I'm indifferent. I didn't wound and I didn't care. And this is a very negative, contemptible ethical attitude. And Hannah Arendt, but she's not the only one, in many of her books, but especially in Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil. She, and also Primo Levi, who is a wonderful Italian author, focusing on the Shoah as well. And they both underline that Nazism and the big tragedy of Europe in the 20th century has been caused not only by the Nazi as aggressors, not only by the Germans who were Nazi, were believer of Nazism, but most of all by indifferent bystander, indifferent onlooker. And this is, my opinion, the question of indifference, of the negating, of denegating care, of pretending not to see or pretending not to be involved. This is very ethically very, very bad. On the other hand, could be easier to pretend that you care very much for the other when the other is very far, is in another continent, far away. I can give money for the poor in India, for example, or Afghanistan or so. I can give money, donation, which is good, okay? But on the other hand, it is too easy, too easy. The other is the other who is near you, nearby. We always have others very nearby. So the other, in this sense, I agree with Levinas, who underlines that the other is most of all and primarily the other in proximity, in proximity. So the real vulnerable for my ethical attitude, the real vulnerable for my ethic to be proved, to be concrete, the real vulnerable is the one who is in proximity, the other body that I can touch and I can take care of. If I pretend not to see the nearby vulnerable bodies and to look as they were and to be indifferent, this is a very non-ethical, negatively ethical attitude. Okay. I begin to be tired.
Right, okay.
Because of my English, I'm sorry.
Okay, just two more questions. Okay. Do you think that the notion of horrorism itself has changed over the years? Let's say right from the Nazi times to what is happening in Afghanistan right now. So my question is, what is stopping the Talibanis from being even more violent? You know, what kind of politics hides behind this controlled aggression? Has the idea of genocide changed? I mean, who's going to stop Talibans if they really install gas chambers? I mean, has it changed, you think?
I think that, I mean, I'm not an opinionist on contemporary history, but of course, I've been very interested in what happened last month, and I'm very worried for the Afghans in general and for the Afghan women in particular. But I think that what make the Taliban be less horrorist than possible, this was your question, why they don't make up gas chamber for all women, is a political strategy, I mean, they need some connections, some alliance, maybe with China, with India, Turkey, and so on. And so they are doing sort of diplomatic political strategy of diplomacy. Mm. And you never know where the horrorist event can happen all in a sudden. Mm. You don't know that. That's always possible, but not only in Afghanistan, everywhere.
Right.
I mean, in the case of the Nazi case is a very special case. Because when we are in front of a totalitarian system, it's a very special case. Because in the case of the Shoah, of the extermination camps, we have an horrorism politically organized, like we had in example in Congo, in Africa, wherever you have an horrorist colonialism, in many cases you have a national organization, a big organization of this horrorist machine. But sometimes you have different cases, not big organization of horrorism machine, where genocide is part of the functioning of the machine, but you have horrorist events who are unpredictable and short, like in terrorist attack. Unpredictable and short. Not part of a big machine, not part of a genocidal organization. And you can have it in Afghanistan or in Europe or in America or in India, I think, because they are totally unpredictable.
Right. So I've just two small questions on the pandemic. My first question is, during the pandemic, we faced primarily three kinds of violence, in fact, four. In India, we had caste-based violence, communal violence all over the world. We had class-based violence. The migrants in India had to walk thousands of kilometers. Why do you think over the centuries, any kind of pandemic has been a breeding ground for violence against the vulnerable? Because especially we have a record number of women and children sexually, exploited in their very household. Why do you think this has been a breeding ground for exploitation of the vulnerable?
From my perspective, this is a bit different because it depends on the context. The context in Italy is that we have a universal health care system, absolutely available by everybody, included immigrants. So we didn't see particularly this aspect in Italy. In Italy, the most vulnerable were, of course, the elderly. We had a lot of people, dying among the elderly, very old people. So in Italy, it is very difficult to perceive a discrimination linked to a social vulnerable condition. In Italy, the general health system took care also of homeless people. We have homeless people in Italy, a few, but you couldn't perceive a really difference because it doesn't exist. I think that the health system in Italy is the best in Europe, completely free and completely universal for whoever enter, not only Italian citizen, but whoever is in the country. But on the other hand, if I can, come si dice, touch a bit your question, which is a serious question, I perceive, because I saw on television in India people walking, no, stream of people walking. It was very impressive for me. We hadn't a phenomenon like that in Europe. It was very impressive. But if I want to touch a bit of your question, I think that not only the pandemic, the current pandemic, but in history, every experience of pandemic, beginning from the plague to the Spanish flu and the smallpox, si chiamano così, smallpox in English, has been an opportunity for change of mentality, change of political organization. So I think it is a sort of test for a society, for a national, a kind of society. And at the beginning, I was among the philosophers that hoped that the pandemic would have been a good occasion, a good opportunity for rethinking democracy, rethinking equality, rethinking vulnerability, and rethinking the human. Now, after 2 years, more or less 2 years, what I saw that the social inequality that we have in Italy are the same. There's not a big difference. And what I see is that what people is longing for is normality. You understand me? For the normal. The life we had before, not a better life or more justice or more equality, but to go beyond the pandemic and to go back to the normal, which is for me a sort of illusion, because I saw that could have been an opportunity to think it better, to think democracy better. But of course, by looking at the situation in India or elsewhere, by watching television, so I cannot be a credible opinionist of situations that I'm not part of. No. But as a mere watcher of television, I perceived that the pandemic in India or in some part of the world, in some areas, was heightening, stressing inequality, stressing the vulnerability of people. Because of course, that people who are cared by international, universal, equal health service are one aspect of the pandemic, but people who cannot have access to care, this is a way, a modality in which the extremely vulnerable is in foresight. And I saw this vulnerability in foresight. I saw it by television, so I was not part of this concrete scenery.
Right, and my last question is, there has been a fourth kind of violence, which I personally term as a medical violence, which has been prevalent in my country, in the United States, and it has been the same stigmatization of the people who have contracted the disease. Let's say, oh, you have the virus, and that's why you are just like the leper. Or someone infected with tuberculosis or cholera, which happened in 15th, 16th centuries. So my question is there anything more vulnerable than the body of a sick human being?
It is all a question of degrees. I mean, either from epistemological attitude or an ethical attitude. It's always a question of degree. As a feminist, I am always accustomed to be very concrete with the question of the body. What is, first of all, vulnerable, the core, the nook, the core, the main core of your vulnerability, especially when a disease is concerned, is the body. So our discourse has always to begin with the care for bodies. As our democracy, our idea of democracy, in my opinion, must begin with the presence of bodies, of life, the needs of life. This is first. If we forget this, we are abstract intellectuals. So this first. But second, there are many interesting questions, as the one you mentioned, is there is sort of ideological construction linked to illness, to a spreading illness. And in Italy we call it unturi. I don't know the word in English, but is sort of spreader. You understand spreader? You know, you can be identified as a spreader. And you can have a social outcasting because of that. So in this sense, the pandemic, the disease, also in my country, could be the magnifying glass what is going on between social relationships. You know, we need somebody to indicate as culpable, somebody who is capo expiatorio, which is the expression in English, expiatory, I don't remember. I'm tired because of the English. I told you, for me 1 hour is enough. But I understand what you mean. I understand what you mean. So I understand that you are very interested in analyzing different aspects, for example, of the pandemic, different degrees of vulnerability, different treatment. And this is very interesting also for me. But I think that as philosophers, we need a ground in which to root our concepts, not to have abstract concepts, void concepts. And the ground for rooting my concepts is the materiality of bodies, as the fact that it doesn't exist life in general, but what exists is singular lives, singular human lives, singular animal lives. And we have to speak of vulnerability beginning from this frame, from this fundamental frame. And then, of course, there are different degrees, social degrees of vulnerability, and this is very clear. I mean, it is clear in India, it is clear in Europe, in Italy. Maybe it is different in different countries, but that vulnerability has a social impact. This is undisputable. This is absolutely true. You see,
Yes.
my tongue has sort of difficulties to go on with this
okay, so we won't take
French language, which is not my language.
Yes, so we won't take questions from the audience today. Yes, so thank you so much, Professor Cavarero,
Thank you.
for your profound insights into the human condition and your immense care for all those who are vulnerable and in need of protection. So I hope we will have such sessions with you again in the near future.
Yeah.
And thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for being so patient and cooperative.
Thank you for very much for giving me this opportunity. It has been a pleasure to have a conversation with you. And I hope that our conversation could go on in the future, in presence, maybe, in presence.
Definitely. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.